Rain streaked down the smeared glass of the lobby doors, dripping from Catherine Miller's coat as she shifted her son from one arm to the other. Ben fussed, his small fists tugging at her collar, his face flushed with tiredness. Kate kissed the crown of his damp hair, whispering, "Almost home, baby." Though the word home felt thin inside these walls. The elevator groaned as she pulled open the gate. Inside, the light buzzed, flickering once before holding steady. She stepped in, her soaked shoes squeaking against the metal floor. Ben whimpered again, and she rocked him gently, humming a tune half-forgotten from her own childhood. Just as the doors shuttered, a hand shot through the gap. The doors slid open again, and a man stepped in. His coat was expensive, a dark wool that looked untouched by the storm outside. His gaze was sharp, self-assured, but he nodded politely as he pressed the button for the top floor. The scent of cologne, clean, restrained, mixed with the faint dampness of Kate's coat. The elevator began to rise with a groan. Ben squirmed, letting out a soft cry. Kate adjusted her grip, embarrassed by the sound echoing in the cramped space. The man glanced over, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, the car jolted hard and froze between floors. The light flickered, dimmed, then steadied into a dull red glow. Silence, except for Ben's cry, sharp and frightened. Kate's heart raced. She pulled him closer, whispering to soothe him. The man pressed the emergency button once, then again, his jaw tight. After a moment, he turned to her. "Looks like we'll be here a while," he said, voice calm, controlled. Then, almost as an afterthought, "I'm Jonathan Hayes." The elevator shuddered once, twice, then stopped with a metallic groan that rattled through Kate's bones. For a moment, there was only silence, the red emergency light casting everything in a muted glow. Then Ben began to cry, loud, sharp, terrified. The sound bounced against the walls, filling the cramped space until it felt like there was no air left to breathe. Kate tried rocking him, her arms aching after hours of carrying trays, scrubbing counters, refilling coffee cups for people who barely looked at her. "Shoo, baby, shoo," she whispered, swaying gently. Her coat was still damp from the rain outside, and she could feel the chill seeping into her skin. She kissed his forehead, pressed her cheek to his soft hair, but his sobs only grew louder, his little body stiff with fear. She felt the heat rising in her own face. Embarrassment, frustration, that awful helplessness that came whenever Ben cried in public. She braced herself for the look, the sigh, the sharp comment she had grown used to from strangers who thought they knew better. But none of that came. Instead, Jonathan crouched a little, lowering himself so he was closer to the baby. His coat, clearly expensive, the kind she'd never dare touch in a store, brushed against the dusty floor as he shifted his weight. His dark eyes softened, the sharpness giving way to something almost tender. "Hey there," he said lightly, his voice calm, steady, with a playful lilt. "Rough night, huh?" "Me too." Kate blinked. She hadn't expected him to speak at all, let alone to her son. Jonathan reached into his sleek leather bag and pulled out a stainless steel water bottle. He twisted the cap slowly, deliberately, letting it make a small clicking sound. Then he tapped the cap gently against Ben's tiny hand. Clink. Ben's cries stuttered into a hiccup. His wet lashes lifted, his round eyes locking on the shiny cap. Another gentle tap. Another clink. Kate felt her breath catch. The crying stopped. "Well, would you look at that?" Jonathan murmured, offering the bottle itself, tilting it so Ben could grab at it with curious fingers. "Strong grip. That's good. Future baseball player, maybe?" Kate gave a small, incredulous laugh, quiet, almost foreign to her after such a long day. You're good with kids?" Jonathan didn't look up, just let Ben gnaw on the cool bottle cap. "My sister's got 3. When the middle one was a baby, I was the only one who could get him to sleep. Guess I've still got a few tricks." The words weren't boastful, just simple, almost offhand. But they landed heavily in the stillness of the stalled elevator. Kate leaned back against the wall, her whole body exhaling, the weight of the day spilling out in that one long breath. She had been holding everything together alone for so long, too long, that the smallest relief felt enormous. Ben made a small gurgling sound, his hands patting the bottle. Jonathan chuckled softly. "That's better, isn't it? You just needed a change of company." Kate smiled despite herself. Usually he doesn't like strangers. Jonathan finally looked at her then. The emergency light caught in his eyes, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw something there. A depth that didn't match the polished exterior. "Maybe he doesn't think I'm one," he said quietly. The elevator creaked above them, a reminder they were still trapped, but Kate no longer felt quite as panicked. Ben was calm. The crying had stopped, and in the dim glow, she realized the stranger had given her more than quiet. He had given her a moment to breathe. For the first time that night, she didn't feel like she was failing. The elevator hummed faintly, as if the old machinery above them were breathing shallow, tired breaths. The emergency light washed everything in a dull red glow, softening Jonathan's sharp features and deepening the shadows under Kate's eyes. Ben had quieted now, clutching the water bottle cap in his small fists, his cheek pressed against Kate's damp coat. The air was warm, but not stifling, heavy with the scent of rain-soaked fabric and the faint trace of Jonathan's cologne. Something clean and understated. Kate adjusted her grip on Ben, brushing his hair back from his forehead. For the first time that day, he seemed peaceful. The silence settled between them, not entirely uncomfortable but charged with something neither of them named. Jonathan leaned back against the opposite wall, his posture deceptively relaxed. "They'll fix it soon," he said, glancing up at the ceiling as though he could see the cables above them. Kate let out a small laugh, dry and tired. "This thing breaks down every other week. I've been stuck before, but never with company." He raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "Lucky me, then." She met his gaze briefly before looking down at Ben. "Lucky's not the word I'd use." Her voice was quiet, but not bitter, more matter-of-fact, the way someone spoke after too many long days. Jonathan studied her for a moment, then asked, "Rough shift, rough month, rough year," she admitted before she could stop herself. The words slipped out, surprising her. She usually kept her struggles hidden, wrapped tight where no one could touch them. But here, in the half-dark of a broken elevator, it felt different, like a secret spoken into a confessional. Jonathan didn't fill the silence with empty reassurances. He just waited. Kate sighed, shifting her weight. "I work at a cafe down on 5th. Long hours, little pay. Rent keeps going up. And—" She hesitated, her throat tightening. "It's just me. Ben's dad left before he was even born." She pressed her lips together, as if sealing the confession before it could spill further. The words hung there, raw and exposed. She expected pity or worse, judgment. But Jonathan's expression softened in a way she hadn't expected. His gaze dropped briefly to the floor before he said, "People see the coat, the job, the facade. They assume I've had it easy. Truth is, I grew up in Cleveland. Single mom. We had nothing. Some nights, dinner was toast if we were lucky. I swore I'd get out. But even now," he gestured vaguely, his hand catching the dim light, "sometimes it feels like I'm still that kid, just dressed differently." Kate blinked, taken aback. She hadn't thought someone like him, polished, confident, clearly successful, could carry anything remotely like her kind of weight. "You don't look like someone who's ever worried about rent," she said softly. "Looks deceive," Jonathan replied simply. A quiet trust began to weave itself between them in that small, suspended space. The kind that didn't come from time, but from honesty, stripped bare when no one was watching. Ben stirred slightly, his tiny fingers curling around the edge of Kate's coat. Jonathan's eyes softened as he watched. "He's lucky to have you," he said. Kate gave a small, weary laugh. "Some days I wonder if he'd be better off with someone else. Someone who isn't constantly broke, tired, and one late payment away from losing a roof." Jonathan shook his head, his voice firm but gentle. "No one else could give him what you do. Not money, not comfort. Just you. The words struck deeper than she expected. For a moment, Kate had to look away, blinking hard at the red glow on the wall. Above them, the elevator cables creaked again, the sound hollow but distant. Time seemed to blur. The city outside kept moving, rain falling, cars honking, lives being lived. But in that elevator, it was as if the world had paused. Two strangers, a baby, and a fragile thread of trust holding them together. And for the first time in a long while, Kate didn't feel invisible. The elevator seemed quieter now, the initial jolt long past, though it still hung suspended between floors. The dim red glow painted everything in hushed tones. Kate with her head bent protectively over Ben, Jonathan leaning against the wall with his hands loosely folded, as though they had been there for hours instead of minutes. Ben had grown heavy in her arms, his breathing soft and even. Kate shifted him carefully, letting the strap of her tote slide down her shoulder. The bag was faded canvas, its corner frayed from years of use. A few crayons poked out from a side pocket, along with a folded grocery receipt she hadn't thrown away. Jonathan's gaze lingered on the bag, not intrusive, just idle. Then his eyes caught on the name stitched faintly across the fabric, letters nearly worn to thread. Miller. He froze. The air in his lungs seemed to thicken. He hadn't heard that name in years, but it landed with a force that pulled him back through time. Back to a night when he was no older than 12, standing barefoot in the hallway of a burning apartment building in Cleveland. A woman's voice shouting, calm but urgent. Hands pulling him toward safety. Smoke, choking and bitter. The faint taste of metal on his tongue. And her face. He remembered it with startling clarity. Mrs. Miller, the schoolteacher who lived one floor below. She had found him and his younger brother that night, guided them down the stairwell when no one else dared to climb back inside. She had saved them. Jonathan's throat tightened. That fire had changed everything. In the weeks after, while their home was rebuilt, a scholarship fund had been started in their names. Not because of charity, but because of testimony, because that same teacher had spoken up for him, had insisted he had potential worth investing in. Without it, he never would have left Cleveland. He never would have made it out. And now, this woman in front of him, her tired eyes, her small son clutching at her coat. Miller. Jonathan cleared his throat softly. Your name, he said, nodding toward the tote. Miller. Any chance you're related to a... He hesitated, as if speaking her name aloud might shatter the fragile quiet. Margaret Miller? She taught at Eastwood Elementary. Kate's head snapped up. Her eyes widened, startled. That was my mom, she said slowly, the words carrying both pride and sorrow. She passed a few years ago. For a moment, neither spoke. The elevator hummed faintly above them, the red light casting shadows that seemed to pulse with memory. Jonathan exhaled, his voice low, steady. Your mother saved my life. Kate blinked. What? There was a fire. Our building. My little brother and I were trapped. She went back inside when no one else would. Pulled us out. If it weren't for her... He stopped, the words catching in his throat. He shook his head, his composure faltering just enough for her to see. I owe her everything. She's the reason I ever got a scholarship. The reason I'm standing here now. Kate's lips parted, but no sound came. She looked down at Ben, sleeping in her arms, then back at him. I never knew. She never told me that story. She wouldn't have, Jonathan said softly. She wasn't the type to brag. She just did what was right. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was thick with something unspoken. Gratitude, recognition, the strange weight of fate weaving threads across years. Kate felt her chest ache, but not from exhaustion this time. From the sudden knowledge that this man, this stranger in an expensive coat, wasn't a stranger at all. Their lives had brushed once before, long ago, through her mother's hands. Jonathan's gaze softened as he looked at her. Seems like she's still saving people. Through you. The words landed gently, but firmly, and Kate felt something inside her shift. For once, she didn't argue, didn't dismiss it. She just held her son closer and let the quiet fill the space. And in that broken elevator, suspended above the ground, a bond rooted itself, not in chance but in history. A low groan shivered through the elevator shaft, followed by the sound of gears grinding back to life. The sudden vibration made Kate clutch Ben tighter, though he barely stirred in his sleep. Jonathan straightened, one hand braced against the wall, his expression unreadable as the lights flickered from red to a weak yellow. Then, with a jolt, the car lurched upward. Slowly, haltingly, it began to climb. Kate's heart thudded in her chest, not with relief, but with the strange dread of stepping back into the world after the stillness they had shared. The elevator, for all its flaws, had become a cocoon. Out there, reality waited. The doors slid open with a metallic sigh, spilling the dim lobby light into the cramped car. For a second, Kate thought the space was empty. Then she saw them. Half a dozen tenants stood gathered near the front desk, some in slippers and robes, others in jackets hastily pulled on. The building superintendent hovered nearby, a set of keys jangling nervously in his hands. A few children peered curiously from behind their parents. They had all heard the commotion, the stuck elevator, the shouts for help echoing through the shaft. Now every head turned. Kate stepped out first, Ben heavy in her arms, her damp coat clinging to her shoulders. Relief flickered across familiar faces, neighbors who had shared thin walls and leaky ceilings with her for years. Then Jonathan followed, and the air in the lobby shifted. Someone gasped. A whispered name rippled through the crowd like a sudden gust of wind. "That's Jonathan Hayes." Kate frowned, uncertain she'd heard correctly. But the whispers grew louder, urgent, insistent. "The new owner. He's the one from the papers. The CEO." Her feet slowed. She turned to look at him, searching his face for denial, for explanation. But Jonathan didn't flinch. He slipped his coat straight, shoulders squaring as though sliding into another role entirely. The relaxed warmth she had seen in the elevator seemed to fold back into the crisp armor of a man used to being observed, measured, judged. Kate's mouth went dry. Owner? Her mind scrambled to piece together what she had overheard in the stairwells, in the laundromat where tenants swapped complaints. Rent hikes. Notices slipped under doors without warning. Evictions threatened like storm clouds. And the name at the center of it all, Hayes. The developer who had bought the building through some faceless company, the one rumored to be gutting properties across Pittsburgh for profit. Her chest tightened. The man who had soothed her son, who had spoken softly about her mother, who had listened without judgment in the half-dark. He was the same man whose signature was tied to the fear that haunted every tenant here. Ben stirred faintly against her shoulder. Kate held him closer, her pulse hammering in her ears. The superintendent stepped forward, clearly nervous but deferential. "Mr. Hayes, we didn't expect." Jonathan raised a hand, silencing him gently but firmly. "The elevator needs urgent repairs," he said, his voice calm, professional now. "I'll see to it." The tenants exchanged glances, murmurs passing like static. Kate could feel their eyes on her, on the way she stood close to him, the child in her arms, the damp exhaustion etched across her face. Her own voice emerged in a whisper, raw and uncertain. You own this building?" Jonathan met her gaze, and for a heartbeat the mask slipped. The faintest shadow of conflict crossed his features. "Yes." One word. Solid, undeniable. It landed heavier than the jolt of the stalled elevator. Kate took a step back, instinctive, protective. The warmth of their shared hour seemed to unravel, replaced by something sharper. Betrayal, confusion, the cruel irony of fate. The man who had reminded her of trust, of kindness, was also the one whose name had been cursed in late-night tenant meetings. But even through the shock, even as she clutched Ben like a shield, she couldn't erase the memory of his voice in the dark, or the quiet way he had said her mother's name. The lobby buzzed with questions, with stares, but for Kate and Jonathan, the noise seemed to fade. They stood opposite one another, strangers again, and yet not strangers at all, caught in the impossible tangle of past debts and present wounds. and the night that had begun with rain and exhaustion now felt like the beginning of something far larger, something neither of them had chosen, yet both were bound to face. Morning came gray and heavy, pressing down on the city like a wet blanket. The streets glistened from the night's rain, buses hissed along curbs, and the air carried the sharp bite of brewing coffee from corner shops. Inside the small cafe on Fifth, Kate moved with slow precision, her body aching from too little sleep. Ben had been restless, stirring often as though he, too, had sensed the shift in her world the night before. She tucked her hair behind her ears and poured another cup of burnt house blend for a regular who never tipped. The smell of grease and frying eggs clung to her skin, and beneath her apron, her clothes still felt damp from yesterday's storm. She told herself she had imagined it, that the man from the elevator couldn't possibly be that Jonathan Hayes. But as she cleared a table and glanced at the newspaper someone had left behind, the truth stared back at her in bold letters. Hayes Property Group expands Pittsburgh holdings. The photo, him in the same coat, the same sharp gaze. Her hands trembled as she gathered the dishes. She forced herself to keep moving. The last thing she needed was her boss noticing. The bell over the door chimed. She didn't look up at first, just carried a tray back to the counter. But then the air shifted, the hush that sometimes follows when someone important walks into a room. Conversations dimmed, forks paused midair. And when she turned, her chest tightened. Jonathan Hayes stood in the doorway. His coat was gone, replaced by a dark suit that seemed too fine for the cracked linoleum and humming neon sign above the counter. He scanned the room once, then found her. His gaze was steady, but there was something else there, hesitation, almost apology. Kate froze, a coffee pot heavy in her hand. What are you doing here?" she whispered, her throat dry. He stepped closer, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I need to talk to you. I'm working. I won't stay long." There was a quiet urgency in his tone that made her set the pot down and nod stiffly toward the far corner booth. The regulars watched openly as she slid into the seat opposite him, still in her apron, hands clenched tight in her lap. Jonathan leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I didn't come here to make things harder. I came because last night, what you saw, that's not the whole story." Kate raised an eyebrow, her exhaustion sharpening into defense. "You own the building. That is the story." His jaw tightened. "Yes, but I bought it under the assumption it was being managed fairly. It isn't." He slid a thin folder from his briefcase and pushed it toward her. Inside, rows of documents, letters with her name printed at the top. Her chest went cold. Eviction notices. Rent increases flagged as special cases. Memos from the property manager highlighting trouble tenants, and her name underlined. Kate's voice shook. "Why me?" Jonathan's eyes darkened. "Because you're not just a tenant. This building used to belong to your family." The words hit like a blow. Kate shook her head slowly. "No, that's not possible. My mother, your grandfather owned it," Jonathan said quietly. "Decades ago. I found the records. It was signed away under circumstances that look fraudulent. Someone stripped it from your family for profit." He hesitated, his gaze softening. "And the man managing it now, he knows. He's been using that knowledge to push you out, hoping you wouldn't dig too deeply." Kate pressed a hand to her forehead. The cafe sounds blurred. The clatter of plates, the hiss of the espresso machine, distant, unreal. She looked down at the papers again, her name scrawled in black ink like a target. Jonathan's voice gentled. "I didn't know until last night. When I saw your tote, your name, I started connecting the dots. I had my office pull records. What I found doesn't sit right. Someone's been exploiting you." Kate's throat tightened. A bitter laugh slipped out. "And what? You expect me to believe you're suddenly my savior? That the CEO who owns half this block just happened to end up in an elevator with me?" Jonathan didn't flinch. He let the words hang, absorbing their edge. Then he said quietly, "I don't expect you to trust me, but I owe your family. And after last night, I can't look away from this." Kate searched his face for deceit, but all she found was a steadiness that unsettled her more than lies would have. From the counter, her boss shouted, "Kate, table 3's waiting." She flinched, then gathered the folder with trembling hands, sliding it into her tote. When she looked back at Jonathan, his expression was unreadable, but his voice was firm. "This isn't just about rent anymore," he said. "This is about what belongs to you." And with that, he stood, nodding once before walking out into the gray morning, leaving her with a baby at home, a shift still unfinished, and a truth that might change everything. The folder felt heavier than it should have, pressing against Kate's hip as she carried Ben up the narrow stairwell that evening. Each creak of the steps echoed her unease. She had barely slept since Jonathan's visit to the cafe, her mind circling the documents he'd shown her, the name Miller etched across decades of forgotten records. When her phone buzzed, she nearly dropped it. The screen glowed with a text from an unknown number. "Unit 3B possible leak. Urgent. Come quick before it spreads." Her stomach tightened. 3B. Her apartment. She shifted Ben in her arms and quickened her pace. But before she reached the landing, a voice cut through the stairwell. "Don't go." Jonathan stood in the shadows, his suit jacket gone, sleeves rolled up as though he had been waiting. His expression was sharp, urgent. "That message, it isn't from maintenance. It's a setup." Kate froze, clutching Ben closer. "What are you talking about?" "I've been digging deeper since this morning. The property manager has been running a racket, illegal evictions, side deals, cash under the table. He's desperate to get rid of you because you're the one tenant who could challenge his whole scheme." Jonathan's gaze flicked to her phone. "That text is bait. He wants you inside and vulnerable." Fear prickled across Kate's skin. She looked up the stairs, then back at Jonathan. His eyes held hers, steady, unflinching. "Come with me," he said, "but don't go in alone." Against every instinct to retreat, she nodded. They climbed together, the stairwell echoing with Ben's small babble and the distant hum of a faulty light bulb. When they reached the hallway, the door to 3B was cracked open, water pooling faintly across the threshold. Kate's breath caught. Jonathan motioned for her to stay back. He stepped forward, pushing the door wider. Inside, shadows shifted. Men in work clothes, tools scattered, a crowbar leaning against the wall. They froze when they saw him. For a moment, the air was thick, electric. Then voices erupted, shouts, footsteps scrambling. But almost instantly, other sounds followed. Heavy boots on the stairs, radios crackling. Police surged into the hallway, pinning the men before they could escape. The crowbar clattered to the floor, sliding to Jonathan's feet. Kate stood frozen in the doorway, Ben clutching her collar, his wide eyes reflecting the flashing lights. The superintendent, pale and sweating, was dragged out moments later, protesting weakly. His words were a blur, excuses, denials, but the officers ignored him. Jonathan turned back to Kate, his breath steady but his gaze fierce. "He was targeting you," he said, "because if you left quietly, no one would ask questions about the rest of this building." Kate's knees felt weak. She stepped inside, staring at her apartment. Her small couch, Ben's toys scattered across the rug, the kettle still sitting on the stove. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt safe anymore. The officer nearest the door spoke briskly. "We've been building a case on this crew for months. Leaks, fires, accidents, all staged to push tenants out. Looks like we caught them red-handed tonight." Kate barely heard him. Her eyes found Jonathan's, searching. "So what happens now?" she whispered. Jonathan's expression softened, though the weight in his gaze remained. "Now we prove what's been hidden. The records, the fraud, the ownership. This building doesn't belong to them. It may still belong to your family." The words hung in the air, impossible and yet undeniable. Kate held Ben tighter, his small hand pressed against her neck. The day had begun with exhaustion and ended with the walls of her life cracking open to reveal something she hadn't dared imagine. That her struggle wasn't just survival, but part of a story written long before she was born. Jonathan stepped closer, his voice lower, steady. "You're not alone in this anymore." The sirens outside faded. The men were led away in cuffs. and the building's tenants gathered in the hall, whispering in disbelief. Faces that had known only fear and resentment now looked at Kate differently, with a glimmer of respect, of hope. And though her world was still fragile, though questions outweighed answers, Kate felt something shift inside her. The elevator had stalled, but it had also carried her to this moment. A night where strangers became allies, where the past returned to shape the future, and where, for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to believe in possibility. She looked at Jonathan, the man who was both cause of her confusion and bearer of her hope, and managed a faint, trembling smile. "Maybe this isn't the end," she said softly. "Maybe it's just the beginning."